I had painted every wall, planted every rose, and on a Wednesday afternoon, with a cup of tea still warm on my table, I was told very politely that it was time to go. What they didn't know, what I didn't know yet, was that I still had one thing they couldn't take. There is a particular kind of October light that only comes to the Pacific Northwest, low, golden, arriving sideways through the trees, like it has somewhere else to be, but can't quite leave. I have lived inside that light for 44 years. I know the exact hour it falls through the kitchen window and turns the oak floor, the color of warm honey. I know which rose along the back fence blooms last, hanging on into November, like it's making a point. I know where the third porch step creaks, and how to step around it without thinking. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am 72 years old, and the house at 14 Wisteria Court in the small Oregon city of Millhaven is the only place I have ever truly understood myself. My late husband Bernard and I moved in when we were 28, newly married, badly underfunded, deeply certain we could fix whatever needed fixing. We were right about most of it. We refinished the floors ourselves over one long August weekend, both of us sanding on our hands and knees, while our first record player sat in the corner of the empty living room, and Bernard sang along to every song whether he knew the words or not. We raised 2 children in those rooms, my son, Mitchell, and my daughter, Addie. We buried Bernard from that porch 6 years ago on a Tuesday in early spring, the cherry tree in the side yard just beginning to open. I want you to understand the house before I tell you. What happened to it? Because what happened to it cannot be understood without knowing what it was. It was not a valuable property in any language that matters to investors. It was a modest craftsman bungalow with a leaking section of roof we'd been meaning to address, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since 1994, and a garden that required a particular kind of stubborn devotion to maintain. But it was mine in the way that the places where your real life happens become yours not through ownership exactly, but through accumulation, through the weight of everything that occurred within those walls. I should tell you about Mitchell. He was a careful child, the kind who read the instructions before assembling anything, who looked both ways twice, who planned ahead with a thoroughness I always admired, even when it exhausted me. He became a property developer in Portland. He drove a car that cost more than our first mortgage. He called on Sundays, reliably, briefly, covering the required topics in order my health, the house maintenance, his work, his wife Carolyn's charity commitments. The calls were regular and efficient, and left me with the impression of having been administratively processed rather than spoken to. I don't say that bitterly. That is simply who Mitchell became, and I love him in the complicated way that you love a person who is clearly your child and also, somehow, a stranger. The first sign came in August, 2 months before the October morning. I need to tell you about. Mitchell called on a Thursday, not his usual Sunday, and said he wanted to come visit. He had some ideas he wanted to run by me. About the future. About planning. I told him I had just made a pot of tomato soup, and he was welcome to a bowl. He arrived with Carolyn and a leather portfolio, which should have told me everything. They stayed for 3 hours. The soup went cold. What they had, they explained carefully, were concerns. I had apparently, in their assessment, been showing signs. Forgetfulness, a tendency to leave lights on, a fall on the back steps in July that I had mentioned to Mitchell only in passing. Because it was minor, I had slipped. I had not been hurt. I had bought better garden shoes the following week. These incidents had been catalogued. They presented them with the even tone of people who have rehearsed, presenting difficult information to someone they expect to be resistant. We've been looking into some options. Carolyn said, her smile. Doing the work that warmth was supposed to do. There's a wonderful community outside Salem. Very active, very social. You'd have everything you need right there. I looked at my tomato soup. I looked at Mitchell, who was looking at his portfolio. I said, I don't need a community outside Salem. I have a community here. I have this house. Mitchell looked up then. He said, Mom, the house is a lot to manage. There's real value here that's just sitting. Carolyn and I have been thinking it might make more sense to. I put my hand up. I said, not today. They left. I washed the bowls. I sat in the garden until it got dark. And I made a quiet note to myself, the kind of note you make not on paper, but somewhere deeper, that the conversation was not finished, and that I needed to understand exactly where I stood. What I did not yet know was how little time I had to find out. I want to be honest with you about the papers, because the papers are the part that still makes me sit down when I think about it too long. 3 years before any of this happened, Bernard had a health scare. A cardiac event, not a heart attack, the doctor said carefully, but a warning, a serious warning. In the weeks that followed, Bernard and I did what responsible people of our age were advised to do. We put things in order. We updated our wills. We established healthcare directives, and at Mitchell's suggestion, made reasonably, practically, with the full logic of someone who simply wanted to ensure his parents were protected. I signed a durable power of attorney designating Mitchell as my legal decision-maker in the event of my incapacitation. Bernard recovered. Life continued. The document went into a folder in the filing cabinet in the study, and I did not think about it again, because there was no reason to think about it. I was not incapacitated. I was gardening and volunteering at the library literacy program, and having dinner with my friend Rosemary on the first Thursday of every month, and living fully in my own life. What I did not appreciate, what I did not think to have explained to me in plain language at the time of signing, was the breadth of what that document permitted, and under what circumstances it could be invoked. Mitchell came back in October. He came alone this time, no Carolyn, which I think was a deliberate choice, a calculation that the conversation would go more smoothly without her. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and I had made tea, because that is what I do when people come to my house. I had also, without quite knowing why, taken out the photograph of Bernard and me from our 30th anniversary, the one taken on the Oregon coast with the light perfect, and both of us laughing at something the photographer had said. I put it on the kitchen table. A reminder, maybe, of who I was and what I came from. Mitchell sat down. He drank his tea. He talked about the market, about property values in Millhaven, about interest rates, about timing. He talked the way he always talked, comprehensively, logically, the room arranged in his mind as a problem to be solved. Then he opened his portfolio and slid a document across the table. It was an agreement authorizing the listing and sale of the property at 14 Wisteria Court. The power of attorney covers real property decisions if there's a documented concern about your capacity to manage your affairs, he said. He said it gently. He said it like a person who had consulted with a lawyer about how to say it gently. I've spoken to Dr. Pemberton's office. Given the incidents this year, they've provided documentation. I stared at the page. I stared at my son's face. He met my eyes and then looked down at the portfolio, and that the looking down was the moment I understood that whatever this was, it had been planned for longer than a few weeks. I'm not signing that, I said. You don't have to, Mitchell said. That's what the power of attorney is for. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the same way I had to sit with it. The document I had signed to protect myself had become the instrument being used to displace me. Not through any forgery, not through any outright illegality, through interpretation, through timing, through the careful construction of a paper record of my supposed decline. A fall on garden steps, lights left on, a date I'd gotten wrong on a check. I did not cry. I am telling you that not to seem strong, but because it is simply what happened, I did not cry. I felt something colder than tears. I felt the particular chill of realizing that you have been outmaneuvered by someone who had been planning longer than you knew. A week later, a car came. A bag was packed not by me. I was taken to Cedarview Gardens, a residential facility 20 minutes east of Millhaven, while Mitchell said the house needed assessment. I sat in the back of the car and watched Wisteria Court disappear around the corner. The October light was doing its sideways thing through the trees. I thought they have made a significant miscalculation. I did not yet know what it was, but I was going to find out. Cedarview Gardens was not unkind. I want to be fair about that. The staff were professional. The meals were adequate. The activities calendar was relentlessly optimistic. My room had a window that looked out onto a courtyard with a small fountain that ran from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, when someone turned it off, which seemed to me to defeat a significant part of the purpose of a fountain. I was assigned a room on the second floor. My name was on a placard by the door, spelled correctly, which I noted with a small private satisfaction. I unpacked my single bag with the methodical calm of a woman who has decided that composure is a strategy. I put the photograph of Bernard on the nightstand. I put my reading glasses on top of my library book. I sat in the chair by the window, and I watched the fountain, and I thought very carefully about what I actually knew. What I knew the power of attorney was real and had been signed in good faith. What I did not yet know whether it had been legally and correctly invoked, and whether the property transfer Mitchell was pursuing had already occurred, was in progress, or could still be interrupted. These were not things I could determine from a chair at Cedarview Gardens. With no phone of my own and no access to the filing cabinet in the study on Wisteria Court. What I also knew, I was not without resources. I had simply not yet identified them. There was a woman in the dining room named Harriet Bloom, who sat at the corner table and read the newspaper every morning with the focused attention of someone who had once been professionally paid to do so. She was 81, sharp-eyed, and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to watch before they speak. I introduced myself on my third morning. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You're the new one. You don't look like you intend to stay." I said, "I have some things to figure out first." She nodded slowly and moved her newspaper to make room for my coffee cup. And that was the beginning of what I can only describe as one of the most consequential friendships of my life. Harriet had been a paralegal for 37 years. She was at Cedarview because of a hip replacement and a son in Vancouver, who had decided, with good intentions, that his mother needed supervised recovery and had organized it without entirely asking her. She was, she told me cheerfully, planning to leave in approximately 3 weeks, when she was satisfied that her mobility had returned sufficiently to manage her own stairs. In the meantime, she had opinions about most things and specific expert opinions about powers of attorney. Over breakfast on my 4th day, I told her the shape of my situation carefully, without the emotional architecture, just the legal facts. She listened without interrupting, which is a rare and valuable quality. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you receive written notice that the POA was being formally invoked?" Not just told about it, a written document, signed, dated. I thought back. Mitchell had shown me the sale authorization. I had not been given any formal invocation document for the power of attorney itself. I told Harriet this. She set down her coffee cup. That, she said, may be your first ground. What followed over the next 10 days was something I can only describe as a second education. Harriet walked me through the legal framework of durable power of attorney in Oregon, its requirements, its limitations, the procedural obligations that attach to its invocation. She was careful to clarify that she was not my attorney, that I needed an actual attorney, and that she could help me understand the shape of the questions, but not answer them with legal authority. She was also clear that there were real grounds to believe Mitchell had moved quickly and without complete procedural compliance. I needed to make phone calls I couldn't make from a monitored phone. I needed to access documents in a filing cabinet 20 minutes away. And I needed to do both before any sale agreement reached the stage of being irrevocable. Harriet introduced me to a care aide named Tomas, who did the weekend morning shift and was studying pre-law at the community college. Tomas was not willing to do anything that constituted a rule violation, but he was willing to let me use his personal cell phone during his break on Saturday. Mornings in the garden, in exchange for my help editing the personal statement for his law school application. I spent 4 Saturday mornings in that garden making phone calls. I located an elder law attorney in Salem named Patricia Okafor through a referral from the Oregon State Bar's Senior Services line. Patricia was direct and fast-thinking, and asked questions with the efficiency of someone accustomed to situations where time was genuinely a factor. She reviewed the power of attorney document, the timeline, and the documentation trail Mitchell had constructed. On the third Saturday, she called me back with something I had been hoping for, but had not been certain of the invocation was procedurally incomplete. There was a required independent capacity assessment that had not been properly conducted. Dr. Pemberton's documentation fell short of the statutory standard. The sale authorization was premature. The property remained, legally, mine to direct. I sat on the garden bench with Tomas's phone in my hands, and the fountain running behind me, and the Oregon sky doing its gray-white October thing overhead. I felt something arrive in my chest that I had not felt since the car turned the corner on Wisteria Court. Not relief exactly, readiness. I thanked Patricia. I asked her what came next. She told me, and I listened to every word. If you're finding the story compelling, please hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Your support helps us share more important stories like this one. Now, let's continue with what happened next. The legal process took 6 weeks. I'm not going to tell you it was simple, or that it didn't cost anything financially, emotionally, in terms of the relationship with my son, that I will spend the rest of my life carefully navigating. None of those things would be true, but I will tell you this every single day of those 6 weeks. I got up, and I did the next thing that needed doing. And that steadiness, that one thing at a time. Steadiness was the most powerful thing I brought to the situation. Patricia filed the petition challenging the POA invocation. The court required independent assessment, which was conducted by a gerontologist who spent 90 minutes with me and concluded, in language that I found both gratifying and faintly absurd, that I demonstrated full cognitive capacity, sound judgment, and no evidence of impairment that would warrant involuntary decision-making oversight. Mitchell did not contest the petition. I think, and I have thought about this carefully, that he had been running on a combination of genuine concern, financial pressure I was not aware of, and a belief that what he was doing was for my benefit, and that when the legal framework made it clear the path was closed, something in him was also, quietly, relieved. Carolyn called Patricia's office to inquire about next steps, which I understood as a white flag communicated through the most indirect available channel. I was home by mid-November. Harriet and Tomas came to see me off. I left a box of almond biscotti for the Saturday morning staff, and a handwritten note for Harriet that she told me later she kept folded in her copy of the Oregon Revised Statutes, which I found entirely appropriate. The house smelled like itself, the particular combination of old wood and garden, and the faint memory of every meal ever cooked in that kitchen. Someone had cleared the autumn leaves from the front porch, which I suspected was my neighbor Dorothea, who maintained strong opinions about curb presentation and had a key for emergencies. I stood in the hallway for a moment, with my bag still in my hand, and simply let the house be around me. The rose on the back fence had finally given up its last bloom. I found the petals on the ground beneath it, brown-edged, finished. I left them there. I called Addie that evening. She had known some of what was happening. I had told her in broad terms from the beginning, wanting her informed, but not wanting to weaponize her against her brother, before I understood what I was dealing with. She cried on the phone, not from sadness exactly, but from the specific relief of a person who has been holding their breath and can finally stop. She said she was coming for Christmas and was bringing her partner and both dogs, and I said I would make the green bean casserole. And she said good, because she had been thinking about it since September. What came after the homecoming was something I had not entirely anticipated, the question of what to do next. I don't mean practically, I knew what to do. There were 100 small acts of reoccupation, relearning the rhythms of the house, resuming the library literacy program, calling Rosemary about the first Thursday dinner we had missed. These things happened naturally, in the order they needed to happen. What I mean is a larger question. I was 72 years old, and I had just navigated, with help, a legal and personal crisis that had depended entirely on my knowing or learning my rights. And in the course of navigating it, I had spoken to Patricia Okafor, who had told me, quietly, that she handled cases like mine more often than most people knew. Older women, documented into vulnerability, moved out of their own lives by people who were certain they knew best. Most of them, Patricia said, didn't know to call. Most of them didn't know they could. I sat with that for a long time, through the short November days, when the light came sideways through the kitchen window and turned the oak floor that particular color of warm honey. Then I called Patricia back and asked if she'd be willing to have a longer conversation. By the following spring, the back garden had tulips for the first time in 3 years. I'd finally gotten the bulb placement right, and the leaking section of roof had been properly repaired by a contractor Dorothea recommended with her characteristic confidence. The house was in better practical condition than it had been in years, partly because the autumn's events had clarified for me that neglecting maintenance was in fact a form of yielding ground, and I was no longer in the business of yielding ground. In January, Patricia and I had started what we were, for the moment, calling the Wisteria Project. The name was provisional. The work was not. The idea was simple and, I had come to understand, urgently necessary, an information resource specifically designed for older adults, particularly older women, who were navigating questions of legal capacity, property rights, power of attorney, and what the law actually permitted versus what family members sometimes believed it permitted. Not a legal practice, not a crisis line, something more like what a very knowledgeable friend would tell you over coffee, translated into clear language and made accessible. Patricia provided the legal expertise, I provided what I had learned about how to translate complicated information into something a person at a kitchen table could understand. 30 years of library literacy work had given me a specific, practiced skill in that translation. Harriet, who had returned to her home in Portland, and her stairs and her newspaper, and her full self-directed life, contributed an advisory role that was entirely informal and entirely invaluable. We began with a series of Wednesday workshops at the Millhaven Public Library, 2 hours, free, open to anyone, covering the basics of power of attorney law, the right to independent legal counsel, the processes by which capacity determinations could be challenged. The first session had 11 people. The second had 23. By the fourth session, people were driving from 2 counties over. What happened in those rooms was not what I had expected. Or rather, it was more than I had expected. I had anticipated information exchange. What actually occurred was something closer to a collective exhale, a room full of people discovering that what they had feared was arbitrary and immovable was, in fact, bounded by law, that they had rights they had not been told they possessed, that the confusion they felt was not evidence of decline, but evidence of a system that had not been explained to them. There was a woman named Louise who came to the third session. She was 69, recently widowed, and her stepchildren had begun discussing placing the family home into a trust. She didn't understand. With management authority she was not sure she had agreed to. She sat in the back row with her hands very still in her lap and listened with the focused attention of someone receiving information they have needed for some time. After the session, she stayed to ask Patricia 3 specific questions. She left with 3 specific answers and the name of an elder law attorney in her county. She sent me a note 6 weeks later. 2 sentences: I kept the house. Thank you. I pinned it above my desk and I have not taken it down. Mitchell and I speak. I want you to know that, because the alternative, the clean, satisfying version of this story, where the villain is excised and everything is better, is not the true version, and I think you deserve the true version. We speak on Sundays, briefly, covering the required topics. Something has shifted in those conversations, a new carefulness on his part, a new plainness on mine. Addie came for Christmas with her partner and both dogs, and the house was loud in a way it had not been loud since the children were small. And Mitchell came for 2 days in the middle and sat at the kitchen table and ate the green bean casserole and did not bring a portfolio. I am not certain what we are building, Mitchell and I. I am certain that whatever it is, I am building it on my own terms. The Wisteria Project now has a waiting list for its workshops. Patricia is in conversation with the Oregon State Bar about a formal partnership for pro bono legal support. Harriet is writing a plain language guide to POA rights in Oregon that we intend to make available through every public library in the state. Thomas is in his 2nd year of law school. He sends me updates periodically. I always write back. There is a thing I have come to believe about the second half of life that I did not understand in the first half. That experience is not simply something that happens to you, but something that accumulates inside you and becomes, if you pay attention, a form of knowledge. The years I spent in this house, the grief of losing Bernard, the disorientation of the autumn I need, never fully explained to anyone again, all of it accumulated into something I am now using, not despite having lived through it, because of it. The October light came back this year, as it always does sideways, golden, taking its time through the trees. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and watched it fall across the oak floor, And I thought about the woman who had stood in this same spot 3 decades ago, sanding that floor on her hands and knees while a record player played in an empty room. She had built something that lasted. She had not quite known at the time how much it would cost to keep it. She had not quite known at the time what she was capable of. Now she does.